Hi there, Social Studies 20 here, taking a look today at internationalism and debt. So we've studied so far in our look at internationalism, we've examined things like internationalism and conflict, the role of the UN in ending conflict, genocide, and so on. We'll talk today about internationalism and debt, and how in some ways internationalism was the cause of debt in the third world. But now we're beginning to realize that, and internationalism is playing a role in changing what is known as the third world debt crisis. So let's talk about the third world debt crisis right now. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but you will today. Um, the third world debt crisis is debt that a government of a developing a country holds, um, but they can't pay back the debt. So what we're talking about when we talk about the third world debt crisis, a series of highly impoverished countries that have accumulated debt, but it's not realistic that they could ever pay off that debt. um, the amount they owe in the debt and the debt interest is beyond what that country generates in terms of its gross domestic product, that prevents them from ever being able to pay off that debt. Something you need to understand, every country is in debt. Canada is in debt. America is in debt. Some of the world's wealthiest economies are in debt. Every country borrows money from other countries, from international banks, and they're all in debt. That's just how capitalism functions. But it's not a big deal for most countries because they can pay off that debt in the foreseeable, if not immediate future, if they had to. In other words, every country's in debt, but their gross domestic product, their GDP, is big enough that if they wanted to, they could pay off that debt. And so, what we mean by the third world debt crisis, we're talking about several highly impoverished countries that have accumulated what is known as unpayable debt, meaning they can never pay off the debt. Um, and that's a big deal for them, for reasons that we're going to discuss very, very soon here. And also understand how debt works. Debt is based on taking a loan out from someone and having to pay that loan back. So if a country borrows, I don't know, let's $1 million. So if a country borrows $1 million from another country or from a bank, they've got to pay off that $1 million plus interest. And if the interest rate on that loan is, say, let's say 7%, that is now significant interest they have to pay back on the $1 million. And the way interest works is that the longer it takes you to pay off the loan, the more interest you pay on the loan. So the initial money that you borrow is known as the principal. So money that you borrow on from a bank or any lending agency is called the principal. Principal. It's hard to write with this thing. So the initial amount of money you borrow is the principal, and the interest you pay is going to be a percentage. So the interest rate is shown in a percentage. Well, interest rate. Like I said, it's hard to write with this. So I hope you understand that when I was a kid, I was very naive. I used to think that banks operated as a service and that, banks took your money and they lent money. It took me a while to realize when I was small that banks make money when they lend money. In other words, if you deposit your money in a bank, they might pay you 5% on that deposit. So you put your money in a bank, they pay you 5% interest on your deposit. I used to think then that they'd just keep that money, and when you wanted it, you would go and get it. No, they don't actually. Banks take the money that you deposit and they lend it to someone else at a higher rate of interest than the deposit. So they take the money that you deposit, they lend it to someone else at 7% interest. 7 minus 5 is, of course, 2%. That 2% is the bank's profit. And that's why banks operate. They're not there necessarily as a service to you, despite what the commercials on TV might say. They are there to make money. Banks are a money-making institution, and that's just how they make the money. Um, Interest rates. And that's not a bad thing. That's just it's just a thing. It's just how capitalism works. It's neither a good nor a bad thing. And that's how loans work. So the principal is the initial amount on the loan. The interest is the amount you have to pay back on the loan. And that's how the bank's going to make its money. For most countries, this is okay because they make enough money in terms of GDP that they can pay back the loan. One other thing that we should talk about, the longer it takes you to pay back loans, it affects your credit rating. In other words, what you're going to find in today's lesson, highly impoverished countries take out an initial loan of, say, maybe $1 million, dollars, like we've talked about here. And then to pay off that loan, they'll take out an additional loan to pay off the first loan. So you're already in debt for $1 million. Dollars. Now you take out maybe a loan of $2 million, dollars, and you're going to use some of that to invest in your country's infrastructure, but you're also going to use some of that to pay off the initial loan of $1 million. Dollars. And then this is going to keep going. You might take out a third loan of, say, $4 million. Dollars. I'm just making these numbers up. You take out a third loan of $4 million dollars to pay off the second loan of $2 million. Dollars. And this just keeps going and going and going. You keep borrowing principal, but you also have to pay back the interest. Another thing you need to understand in terms of money borrowing and money lending is that the more in debt you are or your country is, the more it affects what is known as your credit rating. So a country that has a really good credit rating will have what is called a AAA credit rating. AAA. So if you pay off your debts soon, if you pay your debts on time, you've got a high GDP, you get a AAA credit rating. And if you're delinquent in some of your debts and it's taking you a long time to pay them off, then your credit rating drops to a AA, and so on, single A. And then as it starts to get really bad, credit rating, they change to the Bs. So next lower one would be a triple B, and then a double B, and then a B, and so on. I think you're getting the point. And so what it means is that, for countries that keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing money and never paying off the initial loan, what happens is their credit ratings plummet to the point that they're only given a B, a single B credit rating, highly impoverished countries. And what it means is that you've got a bad credit rating. But what it means is that now you're higher risk for people to lend money to because there's a good chance you might not pay them back, if at all, but for sure you won't pay them back on time. So what they do is because you're a high lending risk, they raise your rate of interest. So if the AAA guy can get interest at maybe 7%, the single B guy is probably going to be charged, oh my God, he could be charged, say, 25% rates of interest. And that's astronomical. That's astronomical to have that happen. Excuse me. And that's what happens in highly impoverished countries. They've taken out loan after loan after loan to pay off the original loans. Their credit ratings plummet to the point that, yeah, they can borrow money, but it's very expensive for them to borrow money because they're higher risk to not pay it back. So they pay way more in interest than developed countries might. And so what it basically means, these highly impoverished countries will never actually pay off the principal. They'll never get to that point. All of their money goes toward paying off the interest, meaning that they're forever in debt and they have to keep taking out more loans to pay off the debt. Um, your parents might own a house. And the average house is sold with the mortgage of, say, 25 years. So in other words, very few people when they buy a house have the average house price in Calgary is about $500,000. Very few people have $500,000 in the bank to buy the house with cash. So what they do is they take out a mortgage, and a mortgage is basically a loan from the bank. So really, it's the bank that owns the house, and you pay back the bank in terms of a mortgage, and that takes about 25 years. And that's just, it's a fact of life that you pay off a mortgage. Most people have one. Uh, for us in the developed world, we're probably going to pay off that mortgage one day. So 25 years is a big part of your life, but you know that one day you'll pay it off. For the developing world, for highly impoverished countries, they look at a perpetual mortgage, I guess, if you want to compare it to a mortgage. They will never finish paying off their mortgage. They will never finish paying off their debt. They'll just keep paying interest forever on the debt. So I hope you understand how loans work, how debt works, how the principal and interest rates work. Forgive my writing on the screen. It's hard to write with the mouse, but I think you get the point. Um, and then to exacerbate this whole situation, it's the developed world that lent them the money in the first place. So the lenders, the contributors to the third world debt crisis would be the IMF and the World Bank. And these are international, UN agencies. So the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank are they're global lending banks that are sponsored by the developing countries, and they will give loans to countries when no one else will. So most banks don't want to touch the country that's got a B credit rating because it's just not in the best interest of the bank to do that. They may never get that loan paid back. So the IMF and the World Bank are very noble in that they will lend money to countries when no one else will. Countries need to borrow money. It's how you build infrastructure. It's how you build schools and hospitals. It's how you invest in your education, training the people of your country so that they can develop and go beyond primary and secondary industry onto tertiary and quaternary. You would have learned that in junior high and especially 10-1. So in many ways, the IMF and the World Bank are great because they lend money to countries when no one else will. And you have to borrow money to develop. It's just the way it works. On the other hand, the IMF and the World Bank are lending this money knowing full well that all it's going to do is indebt that developing country probably forever, and they're going to keep collecting the interest the whole time too. So the IMF and the World Bank, they don't just do this out of charity, they do it because they're making money off of it. And one could argue that they're immoral because they're lending money to people they know can't pay back the debt. Um, we'll talk about that too as the lesson goes on. I hope you get the first page. It's actually a little on the complicated side, and this will help you a lot in 30-1 if you understand this now. Email me if you've got questions. All right, causes for the third world debt. You might be wondering, well, why does this really only happen in the third world? Why not the second world? Why not the first world? And today we've replaced first, second, third world with different connotations. Developed, developing, and undeveloped is how we would look at that now. Anyway, causes for the third world debt, debt of developing countries, undeveloped countries. Number one, colonialism. So you think back to 10-1, colonialism. So a lot of this debt, um, it was debt that was accumulated when these countries didn't really have political freedom. So the example I put there is South Africa. Beginning in the mid 1800s, well into the mid 1900s, South Africa was a British colony, and it was the British Empire that took out all these loans when South Africa wasn't even a sovereign nation. And so the British have since decolonized South Africa and other countries and left them with the debt. And then one could argue, well, how fair is that? I mean, the present day government of South Africa didn't take those loans out. The British did back in the 18 and early 1900s. Why should South Africa today have to pay off the debt when they didn't even take off the loan? So that is one cause. Another cause of the debt crisis is what is known as odious debt. Odious debt. If we had been writing the final exam this year, we would have spent a little more time on odious debt. Um, there's a great definition there by Alexander Sack. If a despotic power would mean an authoritarian government, a dictatorship, not a democracy. If a despotic power incurs a debt not for the needs or in the interest of the state, but to strengthen its own despotic regime, this debt is odious. In other words, if a dictator borrows money but doesn't spend it on his own people and country, infrastructure, and so on, but rather puts that money into his own pocket, that debt is odious. And what the guy's basically saying is that debt is immoral and it shouldn't have to be paid off. And the reasons he gives, well, they're threefold at the bottom here. That debt was incurred without consent of the people. So the country never voted for this despotic leader, this dictator. Why should they have to pay for the debt that he incurred? Not to mention the money he borrowed didn't even benefit the people of the country. He spent that on himself. And finally, this is key, the agency that lent that dictator the money knew of the problem. So whoever lent that dictator the money, they knew that it was happening without the consent of the people, and he knew that it was not going to benefit the people themselves. And that agency could be the World Bank, it could be the IMF, it could be any bank, any lending agency. Now that debt is odious, and according to Alexander Sack and a lot of internationalists, that money shouldn't have to be paid back. Because, the dictator probably by now has been toppled and driven from power or has moved away, and now that country is stuck footing the bill. And why should they have to pay it? Then again, we need to understand too, though, that if you just forgive debt, the bank loses money and that can affect things globally. If banks lose money, they can't lend money, and that can lead to a global recession, and that can lead to a global depression, and that has happened before. At this point in the lesson, you should really watch the blurb here on Idi Amin. It's just a few minutes long. He's a great example of odious debt, a dictator that borrowed a bunch of money, never spent it on his people, and that is odious debt. Take a few minutes and do that right now, or do it later if you want to. That's your call. Third cause of the third world debt crisis was a rise in interest rates. And so this is a little complicated too. Most of these countries, the highly impoverished countries, were decolonized by Europe in the mid 1900s, 1950, 1960. And so they were decolonized and then they borrowed a bunch of money, which is what you do. Now, when they took out these loans in the 50s and 60s, interest rates were relatively low. Lending rates were small, cheap. It was inexpensive to borrow money in the 50s and 60s. But then what happened is by the 1970s, there was a global recession. And so those cheap interest rates, you borrowed money in the 60s at 3%, um, they were getting as high as 25% by the late 1970s, meaning that you could afford to pay off the loan at 3% interest, but you can't when it's 25% interest. And now your economy's in serious trouble. Now you've got to borrow more money to pay off the initial loans, but because it's a recession, the new loans you're taking out are at 25%. If you're lucky, only 25%. They could be higher than that. This global recession was compounded by an oil crisis in the 1970s as well. There was a shortage of oil being pumped by OPEC, which drove up oil prices and led to the global recession. You don't really need to know that. Just know that by the 1970s, there was a global recession, and all of the cheap loans you took out in the 60s had now been exacerbated to well over 20%. And now you're in serious trouble. Here's a stat for you. 6 out of 7 heavily indebted poor countries in Africa pay more in the debt service. And what we mean by debt service, um, interest rates, than the total amount of money needed to achieve major progress against things like malnutrition, preventable disease, illiteracy, and child mortality. Illiteracy is literacy rates. The higher the literacy rate, the better. Child mortality refers to how many kids in your country die before the age of 2 out of 1,000. You want that number to be low because if the number is low, kids are living past the age of 2, meaning they have access to nutrition, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's a sign of development. And so the point we're trying to make here is that 6 of 7 really poor countries in Africa pay more in interest than they do investing in their local infrastructure. They pay more in interest to the World Bank and the IMF than they do building schools, building hospitals, creating jobs, building roads, preventing disease, and so on. And so just let that soak in. Um, what it means is that you're in a perpetual state of poverty because you're always paying off a loan and you can't invest in the things your country needs to be able to develop and get out of debt. It would be like it'd be a circle. You borrow money, you borrow more, and you never get out of debt. But also, you never really develop either, because countries in heavy debt can't develop because they can't invest in these things that you need to invest in to get out of debt, to develop. Catch 22. If governments invested in human development rather than debt repayment, an estimated 3 million kids would live beyond their fifth birthday, and a million cases of malnutrition could be avoided if they could get out of debt. That's kind of sad. Some effects that we'll talk about, some residual effects of the third world debt crisis. Um, in order to get, remember we talked about how countries will take out an initial loan and then they'll take out more loans beyond that to pay off the first one. To be able to get, a third, fourth, and a fifth loan, and even more than that, countries need to undergo what is called a structural adjustment. So your country's already in debt. In order to get further loans to pay off the existing ones, you need to change your economy. You need to give up some sovereignty to get those additional loans. You need to establish a free market system. So you've got to implement capitalism. You've got to privatize your economy. And that means that things that the government used to run will now become privatized. It could be things like transportation, factories, healthcare, education, and so on. You also have to deregulate. It means the government needs to step away from the economy and just let the economy function on its own without government interference. And finally, you need to allow for free trade. So if you allow for this structural readjustment, you can get secondary, tertiary, and quaternary loans, and even more than that, but you got to change your economy. And basically what we're talking about is when you undergo the structural adjustment to get further loans to pay off your debt, you're going to sacrifice healthcare and education because you don't have the money to spend on that. You're spending your money on debt repayment and the structural adjustments themselves. So you never get to the healthcare and education because you're paying for the loans and all of the structural readjustments. As many as 5 million kids and vulnerable adults have probably died in sub-Saharan Africa because of structural adjustments. And it just impedes long-term development. You never really build your infrastructure because you're always paying off a debt. Hmm. President of Nigeria, and this was some years ago now, but I just found it when I was researching. I just found this very, well, it was telling. I'll let you read it. Okay, so Nigeria, the initial amount they borrowed was about $5 billion. So they borrowed $5 billion in the 1980s. They've paid back $16 billion in interest, and they owe an additional $28 billion. And that's because of interest rates. That's because of compound interest, meaning that Nigeria will never get to paying off the actual principal, the initial amount of the debt. So the principal in the beginning was only $5 billion. They paid 16 billion, and then 28 billion they still owe because of interest. That's the third world debt crisis. There is good news. Um, Countries lately are talking about debt relief, and in fact, in 2005 at the G8 summit, this was significant. This shows you the good piece of internationalism now. Um, they agreed on the 2005 HIPC, Highly Impoverished Countries Agreement. So HIPC stands for Highly Impoverished Countries. And what they did is they canceled the debt some $40 billion of debt owed by highly impoverished countries, known as the Multilateral Debt Reduction Initiative. So it's a good thing. Um, and highly impoverished countries include countries like Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and so on. It's a start. There's still a long way to go in combating the third world debt crisis, um, but this was good. They debt relief by two-thirds is a step in the right direction. One last thing I'll leave you thinking about here is the moral hazard. Some people argue against forgiving the third world debt on the basis that, it would motivate countries to not pay back the debt or to borrow money that they know that they can't pay back. And it could be kind of a bad habit creating situation where if you start forgiving debt, two things happen. Number one, the country that was forgiven, what's to stop them from doing it again? If they know that you're just going to forgive it, they'll borrow more money knowing they're not going to have to pay it back. Number two, it hurts the banks, in that the banks aren't getting back the money that they lent in the first place. And if that keeps happening, it also puts a strain on the banks and they lose money. And if they lose money, they can't lend money and people can't borrow money. And then people can't invest and develop other countries. That is known as the moral hazard. And it's an argument against the third world debt relief. Last thing I'll leave you with here is just it's a graph that I found about debt owed by all countries on the planet. And like I said, every country's in debt. You can't function without going into debt at least to a certain point. And you can see the U.S. is in a significant debt, but they make a lot of money that they could pay off that debt in the foreseeable future. Same with Japan, same with China, and so on. Although 31% of the share of the global debt is significant, um, and their debt to GDP ratio is actually quite high, 104%. It means that they owe more money than they take in a year. Now, they could restructure and probably pay off that debt if they wanted to. I just thought you'd find it curious just to see, how significant debt is worldwide and that every country's in debt. Greece is the worst in terms of debt to GDP ratio. They've been suffering through a recession for a few years now, and their economy is actually in serious trouble. I just thought you might like to see that out of curiosity. Well, good job today. Hope you learned a little bit about internationalism and debt, third world debt. At the very least, you understand how loans work and how interest rates work, the principle, and so on. Good job today. Thanks for listening.